Hi there, this is John Drew here from Elevated Planet, and today I am here with my friend, Mr. Chris Stiles, who is a human futurist. And he runs his business, which is all about the human futurology side of things. Hi, Chris, how are you doing?
Hello, John. Lovely to see you again and really looking forward to this chat. Thank you. Now we go into this year, 2024, which, if you will, is the alpha manifestation of 2020. And all you have to do is just sit back, look at the evidence before you, and already what the year is revealing, or what the real year is talking about, is the fact that we can expect much more chaos on a bigger level and a greater intensity during this year than what we've experienced before. So as much as I would love to be sitting here giving good news, I think what is incredibly important is for people to understand that we are really now heading into what is the teeth of the storm in terms of this cycle of nine. And John, as you well know, through the intelligent mathematical blueprints that I build, I can basically see very critical transitions that take place in a person's life.
Yes.
And I do this through patterns, I do this through numbers, but basically I build the construct of their chart, and every single time it is dead accurate, where you can see, if you will, the seasonality in a person's life. Now, the really interesting thing, John, is that heading into 2024, I can see that there are dramatic shifts that take place in both the life of Putin and the life of Zelenskyy.
Interesting.
The shift that takes place in the life of Zelenskyy actually is an extraordinarily negative shift. It is suffice to say that this year, I believe we are going to see a tremendous amount of negativity flowing towards Zelenskyy.
Right.
I also think that the Western world has spent an inordinate amount of money and weapons and resources on the Ukraine, to the point where they now are actually starting to ask, hold on a moment, is this worth it, especially given the fact that the spring offensive in 2023, where Ukraine were meant to drive Russia back, actually failed dismally. And if you really look at the Ukraine-Russian war, it is really a stalemate. In actual fact, if anything, it has advantaged Russia at this stage. Now, just as 2024 sees this shift for Zelenskyy, so 2024 sees a shift within the blueprint of Vladimir Putin as well. So looking at this as these two leaders of these countries, it is not insurmountable to think that the conflict in the Ukraine, as we currently know and understand it, will have changed dramatically by the end of the year. But, John, this is where things start to get really interesting. And just as an aside, because I work with numbers and letters, etc., the really interesting thing is that when I take the country Russia and I add up the numbers around Russia, Russia totals 24.
Okay.
So,
okay. Oh, 24.
24, exactly. And what year are we in? 2024. Okay. So if you, and the interesting thing, John, is that what my research has revealed is that through sequences, everything happens in threes. But if you want to understand how it happens, you actually go backwards, not forwards. So I guess this is the autistic mind, but it's every time a coconut, John. So if Russia totals 24, and we now know that through human futurology techniques, we need to go back three. What do we, 24, 23, 22? What year did Russia invade Ukraine? 2022. What year are we in? 2024. So this is already asking major questions around the fact that, are we actually going to start to see this thing really fizzle?
Right.
Then the really interesting thing, John, and this is, I think, where it starts to get extraordinarily interesting in terms of this year and what we're going into in terms of 2025, is if we take China and we do the human futurology analytics around China. Now, China totals 26.
Okay.
So if we go back 3, we get 26, 25, 24. So if I were to look at the architecture of what is going on, Russia, if you will, is literally a wounded country. But the question that people need to ask is what is happening behind the scenes on a geopolitical and socioeconomic level, strategy-wise, with and through China. And John, I think this is where we're going to see tremendously interesting developments taking place this year. Because as I said, China begins, if you will, 2024 and goes through to 2026. And John, having plotted the intelligent mathematical blueprint of Xi Jinping, who is the leader of China, what is so interesting is that I can see that there are 8 years of his life ending in 2026 that are governed by exactly the same sequence. So what ends in 2026 began 8 years earlier. But through deeper analytics, John, I can see that the greatest risk within those 8 years actually exists next year in 2025, more specifically, John, in the third quarter of 2025, which is the months July, August, and September. So the reason I'm sharing this with you is, as a human futurist, looking into the future, I am most definitely seeing vastly escalated levels of chaos. I think that what Russia began, China is going to pick up on, just on a much, much bigger scale. It's almost, if you will, like Russia went in, made the first really aggressive move to create anarchy and chaos throughout the world. But China is then going to piggyback or capitalize on this. And this could happen through a couple of ways, John. China, for example, could maybe decide to invade Taiwan, especially given the Taiwanese election that is coming up now on the 13th of January. If they don't like the outcome, they could choose to invade Taiwan. Now, all of a sudden, should they do this, you've got wars raging on multiple fronts. You've got a war in the Middle East and around Israel and the Gaza Strip. You've got a war raging in the Ukraine. You could have a war in the South China Sea around Taiwan. So suddenly, resources, if you will, or war machinery spread out all over the place. The next thing we could see, John, is we could see bioweapons, or if you will, pandemics coming to the fore in a much, much greater way. And this is something that I feel very strongly about because, John, if we just pause for a moment and think about everything working in cycles of 9, if we go back to 2020 and COVID-19, okay, and we count 8 years forward from 2020, we get to the year 2028. Now, remember, John, this is not about thumb sucking, okay, or clutching at straws or conspiracy theory stuff or whatever. This is actually about working with facts. And when you know and understand facts, you begin to ask intelligent questions. That's what I try to do, John. I try to ask intelligent, thought-provoking questions around what I know and understand through patterns. So if this is the case, if there is, for example, a pandemic plan or a weaponization strategy around the use of pandemics in order to create global chaos, then what began in 2020 is actually going to run all the way through to 2028.
Right.
So there's a timeline. Now, I'm not saying that this is the case, but the fact of the matter is, it was very interesting for me a while back to actually come across an article where they spoke about a university actually already having done deep research into pandemic strategy from 2020 to 2028. Now, why would that timeline have just suddenly appeared? 2020 to 2028. Yet, when I apply the intelligence of my human futurology architecture to it, it makes perfect sense. So the thing is, John, the point I'm trying to make is that what we are going into is a time of extreme chaos. I think we're going to see a much greater threat throughout the world around, if I can call it, bioweapons or diseases or viruses, which are of course going to create a tremendous amount of fear.
Yes.
Because there's nothing that one fears more than that which you cannot see.
Yes.
I also think that we are going to see a tremendous power struggle taking place between the East and the West from going into 2025, 2026. And to me, John, what this is doing is it is really, if you will, pitting the East against the West, if you will, China against America, and all of these various entities. If you look at it, China has created this tremendous economic alliance called BRICS, through which is basically looking, and who knows what threats China could pose to America through closed user loop trade and circumventing the need for the petrodollar to be able to pay for oil. So if you look at all of these things, John, in a nutshell, what we are seeing is that everything is building very dramatically towards 2030. Because if the next cycle begins in 2026, then let's just go 26, 27, 28, 29. So 2029, if you will, is the next 2020, or could be the next 2020, unless there is significant change or significant intervention. And this is really, really interesting, John, when one takes a step back and then also begins to apply your mind in terms of the World Economic Forum's Agenda 2030. Because all these timelines are converging. So, you know, John, we could sit here and we could basically say, well, this could happen, that could happen. Guaranteed we're heading into a time of extreme chaos. I mean, just now I can talk to you about how I'm seeing the political landscape in terms of the US and the UK elections. But John, on the back of this, I think what is so important, and this is where the work that you and the work of that Elevated Planet and the work that we at Human Futurology do is so important, is on the back of this onslaught. I believe that we are going to experience as humans where suddenly there will be no normal. Never mind a normal and then what was called the new normal. There will actually just be no normal. And on the back of no normal, we will be experiencing change and fear and anxiety on a level that we've never experienced before. And what does this bring into the fore, John? It brings to the fore the importance of your mind.
Yes.
Of controlling and looking after your mental sovereignty.
Yes.
Because even if there is chaos going on out there, John, let's face it, when 2020 happened and COVID-19 or coronavirus was identified and the governments through the World Health Organization decided to go into lockdowns or whatever, we had to conform, we had to comply, because we are citizens of a country. Now, the thing is, when you have to conform or comply, and this to me is the difference between fighting the system and understanding that there is a system, but then also looking at the system, realizing, right, we are in dark times, possibly the darkest of times. But even though we are in the darkest of times, I am going to ensure that I look after and nurture and take care of my mental sovereignty through understanding that there is beauty out there, there are wonderful things, and that while I am part of this big storyboard through being a citizen in a country, I don't necessarily have to allow my world to be as fear-driven as that of everybody else who's buying into everything lock, stock, and barrel.